Hi everybody, it's Father Peter Anthony here. This is a short lecture on the Epistle to the Hebrews, which I should have given last week as part of the St Edmund's Christian Studies course here in the Diocese of London. So this lecture is principally intended for those who would have been there at the lecture, so that you can receive the teaching that you need in order to complete the New Testament module. There's a set of PowerPoint slides which I think should have been sent to you and which accompany this lecture. So the lecture really represents me just talking through those PowerPoint slides, which would have been the basis of the lecture that I would have given had I been able to be with you all. If anybody else wants a copy of those slides, I'm very happy to send them to you. All my contact details are on the parish website of St Benet's, Kentish Town. So we're thinking today about the Epistle to the Hebrews. And I think I want to begin quite simply with the question about what I would usually begin if we were all in a room together. I would begin with the question, what do you know about the Epistle to the Hebrews? The frequent answer, which can be deduced from the blank faces that usually look up to me at that point, is not very much. And that's a really important point. We don't read it very often. You might occasionally, I once had a very earnest evangelical in the audience at one of these lectures, who put his hand up and said, "Ah, yes, but we had a 6-week preaching course on the Epistle to the Hebrews once." And I said, "Well, how long ago was that?" And he admitted it was 8 years ago. I once had someone from a slightly more spiky Anglo-Catholic church mention that Father had once read a bit of the Epistle to the Hebrews in front of the Blessed Sacrament at benediction, but other than that, she couldn't quite remember very much more about it. I think that's really important that we think about the context in which our reading of any text takes place. And the Epistle to the Hebrews suffers slightly from the fact that our liturgical exposure to it is frequently a lot more limited by comparison with other bits of the scriptures like the Gospels or Paul's epistles. So that's an important point to begin with. So if we look at our first sets of slides, I want to just very briefly move through the argument of the Epistle to the Hebrews. So we begin with that really significant prologue. In chapter 1. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. I think if there's one big idea that lies at the heart of the Epistle to the Hebrews, it's essentially this, talking about Jesus as a priest. The idea that Jesus might be a high priest or a priestly figure is one that occasionally bubbles up elliptically in other parts of the New Testament, but nowhere is it so explicitly expounded and developed as in this text. And the writer begins with a really important question, which is quite simply, who is Jesus? But I want to argue that he answers that question with language and ideas that will not be entirely unknown to his readers. I don't think the Epistle to the Hebrews crashes onto the stage of New Testament ideas, bringing thoughts, reflections and conceptions that didn't exist. Fundamentally, it's beginning from first precepts and ideas that are established and accepted about Jesus, and then developing them out and working out what the consequences are of those. So, for example, if you compare some of the language that we hear in Colossians with those first few words of Hebrews, you'll notice there's quite a few connections. Think of Hebrews 1 verse 6. He brings the firstborn into the world. Well, Colossians talks about Jesus as the firstborn of all creation. Think of Hebrews' assertion that Jesus is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. Well, again, Colossians talks about Jesus being the image of the invisible God. Exact imprint is a very important and intriguing word that Hebrews uses to talk about Jesus. The Greek is aporgasma. It's curiously a word that's easy to remember, I find. Through whom he also created the worlds, we're told in Hebrews. Again, think of those echoes from Colossians. All things were created through him and for him. And a lot of what's said in those first few verses of Hebrews echoes, I think, as well, some of the language that we hear in the wisdom tradition. When you think about the book of wisdom in chapter 7, exalting wisdom as this amazing figure who accompanies God in all that he does. For wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. For she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance to her. She is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets, for God loves nothing so much as the person who lives with wisdom. There seem to be close echoes in terms of the kind of language and conceptual universe that these writers are all living in. So what I want to argue is that our writer begins with language and ideas that would have been familiar to his audience. Quite direct and concrete and well-known assertions about who Jesus Christ is. And from there, from those key first assertions, he then builds on that argument to point to ways in which Jesus could be seen as a priestly figure. The way he does it is this. The first thing he starts talking about is the high priest himself. This is the Jewish high priest that will have offered sacrifice in Jerusalem in the temple, particularly by the time of Jesus in the temple that had been substantially rebuilt by Herod. And in chapters 2 to 5, you see a lot of reflection on this figure of the high priest doing his job in Jerusalem. The key thing that our writer points to is the way in which the high priest is a representative figure. He stands on our behalf, or on the writer's behalf, the Jewish people's behalf, in Jerusalem as part of that worship there in the temple. He is able, we're told in chapter 5, he is able to deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. So the high priest himself is a representative figure. And then the writer points out that Jesus, in a way, is a representative figure too. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears, we're told in chapter 5, verse 7. So just as the high priest is a representative, a lot of what Jesus did pointed to him as a kind of representative figure of humanity, making petition to God. We then see a new idea emerge. And that is that Jesus is not just a priestly figure, but a Messiah figure as well. And the key way in which this happens is the process by which the writer in chapter 5 uses two really important quotations from the Psalms to point to Jesus as the Messiah. But it's really important that we notice that they are also bits of the Psalms that have strongly priestly overtones. They're from Psalm 2, verse 7. You are my son, today I have begotten you. And Psalm 110, verse 4. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So Jesus has a representative character, just as the high priest does. And the writer points to Jesus both as priest and Messiah. Now, we've got to the point now where we're at the slides all about Melchizedek. Who on earth was Melchizedek? So Jesus is being pointed to as a priest like Melchizedek. The honest answer is no one has a bloody clue who Melchizedek was. There's just one very, very brief elliptical mention of this extraordinary and mysterious figure in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 to 20. And King Melchizedek, we're told, and King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. He's this curious priestly figure who meets Abraham. He's a king, but he's also a priest, and he's associated with the offering of bread and wine. It won't take very much to work out that within Christian history, Melchizedek becomes very closely associated with the Eucharistic sacrifice and a really important figure. Even though there's just this teeny glancing mention of him in the book of Genesis, he becomes a very significant figure in terms of reflection and speculation in Eucharistic theology. You'll notice I've appended a PowerPoint slide showing a lovely mosaic from Ravenna with the three great offering figures, priestly figures, mentioned in the Roman canon, Abel, Abraham and Melchizedek. So how on earth is Jesus like this rather odd figure of Melchizedek, and what do we know about what people were thinking about Melchizedek at the time of Jesus and at the time of the writing of the Epistle to the Hebrews? Well, we notice from 1 Maccabees, particularly chapter 14, the way in which the Hasmoneans, who were ruling in various ways, with various ups and downs, the Holy Land at the time of Jesus, that they would rule until, quote, a trustworthy prophet should arise. So in their claims to rule, there was a coming together of this idea of the priestly and the kingly, and they were quite captivated by Melchizedek. We see some speculation and thought about this figure of Melchizedek in the documents that were unearthed in Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's particularly a document called the Damascus document, written just before the time of Jesus, where there are sort of hints that there's a priestly and royal Messiah is expected. But the point is, these are two different people. It's not one priestly and kingly figure, but we have a priestly Messiah and a royal Messiah. They seem to be being kept separate. Amongst those texts, there is, of course, the famous Melchizedek document, in which those early sectaries describe Melchizedek really as a sort of mythic representative of God on the day of judgment. We also notice that Melchizedek pops up in Philo's writings. Philo is a philosopher, especially living in Alexandria, who tried to explain a lot of Jewish thinking for the Greek-speaking world. He wrote a text called The Allegory of Laws, in which he sort of tried to kind of explain the Mosaic law to Greek writers and thinkers. And in that, he talks about Melchizedek representing reason, because he is eternal. So all these little sort of mentions of Melchizedek floating around in the ether and in people's imaginations, often connected with Messiah figures who are awaited, and frequently bringing together ideas of priestly ministry and character and kingly status. I think the key point that the writer is making is that Jesus' priesthood, like Melchizedek's priesthood, is eternal. It is something that lasts beyond his earthly life. And if it's eternal, then somehow Jesus' priesthood continues to be exercised in heaven, and not just on earth. And if therefore it's being offered in heaven, then it must be better than what was the priesthood that was exercised before the time of Jesus. So the figure of Melchizedek, I think, is a way of pointing to Jesus' own priesthood being eternal. In other words, not just something that's associated with one place of worship in Jerusalem at one particular time, but something that is universal and which he continues somehow to exercise, even though he's now in heaven. So we're now at the slides that begin with the question, what sacrifice does Jesus offer? So if Jesus is being pointed to as in some sense a high priest, the point of a priest is that he offers sacrifice. What is the sacrifice that Jesus offers? Really good question. I think the first thing that the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews asserts is that the sacrifice that Jesus offers initiates a new covenant. So lots of different sorts of sacrifice at the time of Jesus, offered for different things and for different reasons, and to seal and sort out lots of different kinds of vows, covenants, and agreements. So Jesus' sacrifice ushers in a new covenant. In other words, it's an offering made to seal an agreement between God and his people. In verse 6 of chapter 8 we hear, but Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises. So the first kind of sacrifice that Jesus offers is a covenant sacrifice. But what Jesus does for us also deals with sin. Now this whole idea of sin comes back time and time again through Hebrews. It's a big issue that the writer and the people he's clearly writing for quite sort of neurotically captivated by. You know, what do we do about sin, the things we do wrong? How does the life of Jesus, what he did for us, how does that somehow make that better and sort that out? Well, just as you could offer an atonement sacrifice, as the high priest once he would offer an atonement sacrifice in the temple, Jesus does a similar thing. Again, we're told that Jesus entered once and for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, in order to obtain an eternal redemption. So that brings us on to the third character of the sacrifice that Jesus offers us, which is then explained in chapter 9. One of the principal characteristics of Jesus' sacrifice is not just it's a covenant and an atonement sacrifice, it's a sacrifice in which Jesus himself is the victim, is the offering. That's really important. He has appeared once and for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. We're told in verse 26 of chapter 9. And one key thing which the writer asserts is also that it's a sacrifice that does not need to be repeated. So one of the things that's frequently said through this text is that one of the things that's, one of the issues at the heart of temple sacrifice in Jerusalem is that these sacrifices need to be offered time and time and time again. How do we ever get out of this kind of hamster wheel of constantly needing to offer sacrifice to placate an angry God? Well, here in Jesus, we see a sacrifice which does not need to be repeated. It's so efficacious. That's particularly expounded in chapter 10. For by a single offering, we're told in verse 14, he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. So we now come on to the PowerPoint slides to do with the temple. If Jesus is a priest and he's offering sacrifice, well, where's the temple that he does it in? A really big idea in the Epistle to the Hebrews is that there is a heavenly temple of which the earthly one is merely a shadow or copy. You've got 3 or 4 quite interesting slides in front of you showing you what the Jerusalem temple will have looked like. It was enormous, absolutely enormous. Herod had rebuilt it on a vast scale. It must have been so impressive to go and see the place. And there's all sorts of things going on around and about it and in it. But the most important are those 2 slides that show you what the Holy of Holies looked like. God dwelt in the middle of the Jerusalem temple in the Holy of Holies, and gradually emanating out of that central point of his dwelling, more and more people could come closer to him. The closest to the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could come. And then you have the court of men of Israel, you have the court of Israel, the court of the Gentiles. And the point of this is it sort of signifies God at the heart of his creation. So the temple in Jerusalem was where God was felt to dwell and where sacrifice was offered to him. And the writer of the Hebrews says that one of the things we work out and realise as a result of the life of Jesus is that that temple is actually merely a shadow or a copy of the greater temple, the place of God's dwelling in heaven. And if we were concerned about having access to God here on earth, through Jesus we have access to God in a cultic sense, I suppose, now in heaven through his sacrifice. Spend a few moments just looking at those images of the temple, because it's a really, really important concept there. Now, let's have a think about who Hebrews was written for. This is quite a tricky question. All we have in front of us is the text. So all we can do is guess from certain things that are said or are not said who the intended audience of this text was. All sorts of people, all sorts of theories, and you can spend all day long just chasing your tail around these. But I think it is quite important that you have in your mind a hypothesis of at least who you think this text was written for. There seems to have been some sort of doctrinal problem that this text was written to correct. Chapter 13, verse 9, tells us that the text is written for those carried away by all kinds of strange teaching. Though it's difficult to precisely get to the bottom of what precisely the strange teaching was. But there's clearly some sort of theological or doctrinal debate going on at the heart of the community that this text is written for. And someone outside it has got to hear about it and is writing to them to say, get your act together. It's clear from Hebrews 6, verse 6, that apostasy has also taken place. People have moved away from the Christian faith. There are little hints that persecution may have afflicted the community for whom this text is written. Hebrews 10, 32, 13, 3, 7 and 23. We've got to be really careful. Lots of people have this idea that all Christians were universally persecuted throughout the entirety of antiquity. Persecution in the early church was, it certainly happened. I'm not claiming it didn't happen, but it was much more sporadic and chaotic and up and down than many people sometimes imagine. So there are hints at some sort of persecution. Are we talking about state persecution, or are we just talking about tensions in local communities and suspicion about who these Christians are? There's also bother about certain people in the community not worshipping together. an intriguing thing to be thinking about at this time, that we're all banned from going anywhere near our churches. So it appears that some people had lapsed from the Christian tradition of worshipping together. That's Hebrews 10:25. And I think a related question is probably one of the most significant in studies of the Epistle to the Hebrews. When was the Epistle to the Hebrews written? Now, this can be a kind of light touch paper and retire question with scholars of this epistle, because lots of varying different opinions emerge. One of the great things that we need to get in our heads when we think about when Hebrews was written was probably the most significant date that you need to remember if you're studying the New Testament, and it's 70 AD. In 70 AD, or in the years before 70 AD, there'd been a Jewish revolt in Palestine against its Roman occupiers. It was probably the worst and most chaotically organised, haphazard revolt in the history of badly organised revolts, and the Romans systematically and comprehensively put the revolt down and re-established much further Roman rule. And in 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem was besieged and taken by the Romans, and we don't quite know how, because it certainly looks as though orders were given that the temple be preserved, but somehow it caught fire and the entire temple burnt down to the ground and was destroyed. This was a terrible, terrible event, and caused all sorts of trauma in Jewish writing and reflection at the time. Now, one key question is this: was Hebrews written before or after 70 AD? Let's look at the question of whether it was written after 70 AD. If the temple has been destroyed, the temple in Jerusalem, and there's no longer any worship there, then lots of Jewish communities are thinking to themselves, what on earth do we now do that there's no place to worship the living God? And all sorts of different answers are come up with. You could argue that Christianity is itself one response to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You don't need to worship in the Jerusalem temple because you have access to God through your Messiah, Jesus Christ. Is Hebrews, therefore, a way of dealing with the fact that the temple has been destroyed, particularly for Jewish communities who may still have had a faith in Jesus Christ, but may still have been offering sacrifice in the temple, or may still have looked to Jerusalem as the place where the God of Israel dwelt? So is the most obvious thing to say, it's perfectly obvious that Hebrews is written after 70 AD. Well, there's certain pieces of evidence. We know that Clement of Rome knew about the Epistle to the Hebrews as early as 96 AD, so certainly by that point we know that the text exists. Does that, or doesn't it, point to a later dating? We don't know, but it certainly means that by that point, later on, it's known about. The text certainly seems to have links with Rome. At the end of the epistle in Hebrews 13, there's a curious mention at the very end. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those from Italy send you greetings. So was the community that the writer was addressing, were they actually in Rome, and the writer is writing from outside Rome, or is the writer writing from Rome? There's all sorts of different theories about this. Why is Italy and Rome important? Well, if you look at the slides I've shown you of a triumphal arch, you'll notice that that's the Arch of Titus. You can see it in Rome. It's really fascinating to go and find it. It's basically a monument. Is erected in 81 AD by Titus's brother, to commemorate his putting down of the Jewish revolt. And on the side of it, you'll see in these images, one of the things they did was when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, they gathered together vast amounts of loot from the temple, all the objects that were of cultic use, particularly the menorah from inside the near the Holy of Holies and other things. And you'll see from the pictures, they were paraded through the city of Rome. Now, is it possible that there's a Christian community in Rome of Jewish origin and strongly influenced by Jewish thinking that sees this procession and finds it, quite frankly, terribly traumatic? They need, therefore, to start thinking about how they conceive of the world and their relationship with God now that there is no physical place on earth that they can talk about as being where God exists, God dwells. So, are we looking at maybe a community that has a connection with Rome, that's certainly aware of the fact that the Jerusalem temple has been destroyed? And is Hebrews in fact quite a late document written after 70 AD? So that's theory number one. It may not surprise you to know there's another theory. Or, I mean, I'm simplifying slightly, saying there's two theories, but at least these are the broad contours of it. What about if Hebrews is written before 70 AD? What if the point of Hebrews is to address a Jewish community that is tempted precisely to lapse back into temple observance? What if you have a writer who thinks that Christians shouldn't be too worried about the temple? We have Jesus Christ who died on the cross and took away our sins. We don't need to offer sacrifices time and time again in Jerusalem. And notice that very frequently this is a real locus of neurotic concern, particularly in communities of Jewish origin, that they were really concerned and worried about how one dealt with sin. So is it in fact addressed to that category of person? This idea of sin, it sort of bubbles up and down through the whole text. It talks about the sin that clings so closely, as if the people the text addresses are really, really worried about what we do about sin. And are they tempted to go back to the experience of worshipping in the Jerusalem temple or paying for sacrifices to be offered in Jerusalem? Look at Hebrews chapter 9, particularly verses 6 to 10. Listen to this. This doesn't sound as if the Jerusalem temple has been destroyed. This sounds very much as if it's all still going and the racket is still, the show is still on the road. Have a listen to this in chapter 9. Such preparations having been made, the priests go continually into the first tent to carry out their ritual duties, but only the high priest goes into the second, and he but once a year, and not without taking the blood that he offers for himself and for the sins committed unintentionally by the people. By this the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary has not yet been disclosed as long as the first tent is still standing. This is a symbol of the present time, during which gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshipper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time comes to set things right. That doesn't sound very much as if the text is written after 70 AD, a time when the temple has been completely destroyed and everyone's entirely heartbroken by the whole thing. It sounds as if the temple, the cultic life of the temple is continuing at full tilt. So that's an important piece of evidence that those that want to argue for an early dating often point to. We can see other communities as well who exist before 70 AD, not least the Qumran community, who went out to live a separate life on their own and whose collection of texts, those discovered in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls are. You see, in their idea, one is to leave society and retreat into desert purity. They frequently use similar language of their community being a kind of metaphorical tabernacle or temple-like community. So we can point also to other communities who, before 70 AD, retreated from the main cultic life of the temple and saw themselves as the embodiment of the life of the temple. The other thing we also have to question is a certain sort of historical approach to the Epistle of the Hebrews also frequently talks about those first sections of chapter 1 that we began with, that the Christology is very high. In other words, they make very particular assertions about Jesus, not as the lowly carpenter of Nazareth, but as the exact imprint of God's perfect being, the entity through whom he created all the worlds. And that if it's very high Christology, making very definite assertions about the divinity of Christ, it must be late. That is a nonsense. There is no reason at all why all high Christologies have to be late Christologies. That's a really important idea. I just think the logic's a bit defective there. It's perfectly possible for a high Christology to be a late Christology, but it doesn't have to be. And I think the point of comparing those early assertions about Jesus with the language used of Christ and of wisdom in other parts of the scriptures shows that I think it's actually language that may have been in quite wide use. I think the most important argument for an early dating is, of course, that if the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, surely that would be the most convincing argument that the writer could possibly deploy. It would be the silver bullet at the heart of his argument. The temple in Jerusalem is merely a shadow of the perfect temple in heaven. Jesus is the perfect high priest. We therefore don't need the temple anymore. And look, it's all been destroyed and got rid of. And that proves that our new high priest, Jesus, is the one we need to be looking to. That argument is never made. We have a huge text constantly going on about the cultic life of the temple in Jerusalem, and yet not one mention is ever made of the fact that it has been destroyed. So could it in fact be that the text stems from before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? You have to make your mind up about it. Every time I give this lecture, all these hands go up and say, well, that's very interesting, but what do you actually think? I am keeping my opinion on this matter guarded for the moment and shrouded in mystery, so that I have a very definite opinion on it, by the way. But for the minute, I'm not going to reveal that hand, so that you can actually go away, read the text, have a think about when you think it might have been written and what the most convincing arguments and pieces of evidence are. So there we are. I've cantered through these PowerPoint slides quite quickly. Usually we would have spent a whole evening going through them with several breaks and the possibility for questions on one thing or another. So I'm sure you'll have lots of questions to ask. If you do have any, please be in touch directly by email, and I can answer them as best I can. Otherwise, I hope that was a reasonably useful, brief introduction to the epistle to the Hebrews. And I think I've included most of the things there in this brief 40-minute video that we would have gone through with our whole evening of teaching. So anyway, I hope all goes well. I'm so sorry that your New Testament module has all been put up the spout by the present emergency, and I hope you enjoy further reading and then having a good go at the assignments that are set to you. Thanks very much indeed.